Welcome to the General's Gentleman.
Hello and welcome back to the RTS Podcast. Today we'll be talking about everyone's favorite topic and the topic that people on the internet get very angry about, and that is balance. So returning seems to be, as always, which I'm very fortunate for, is Mr. Wayward Strategy. Hello, Brandon.
Hey everybody, how's it going? I'm always happy to be here. I get to inflict my opinions on all of you some more.
Inflict your opinions. That's beautiful. And we have a first-time guest, Mr. Aiden. Hello.
Hello.
Tell us a bit about yourself. What do you do? Because you have a cool gig going on as well.
Sorry, what's that?
You have a cool gig going on.
Oh yeah, my name's Aiden. I'm a game designer. I've been making games since about 2006. Currently working at Blackbird Interactive. So the people who most recently released Hard Space Shipbreaker and Deserts of Karak.
Nice.
It's awesome. I love Deserts of Karak, so thank you for whatever part you played in that.
I didn't play any part in that, but I'll tell him
okay.
you said thanks. Yeah.
I'm sure that
I actually owe those guys a lot. I did a very, very brief consulting gig with them at the end of 2016, and that was when my youngest son was born, and I had lost my job the day he was born, and the Blackbird really kind of helped me out in a dark time in my life. So.
Oh wow, that's good to know. Yeah, I had no idea.
Yeah.
Cool. I'll tell him you said hi.
Yeah. Rory. I worked with Rory. So yeah, I owe those guys a lot.
Nice. Okay, so this topic started because I was just chatting to Aiden, and then he said, "You know what? I think balance is overrated." So he's asserting the thesis, and I both agree and disagree with him. And I'm sure Wayward also will have a mixed response. So what do you think, Aiden?
Yeah, I'm in the same.
Why is balance overrated?
Me on the spot. I'm trying to remember my rationale for it. I think the main crux of it for me is that sometimes I think fun gets sacrificed a lot in the pursuit of balance. And sometimes when you're balancing things, it's possible to tune a lot of the fun and the excitement out of it. And it makes me think about experiences like Fortnite. You know, I don't think anyone can argue that Fortnite is a balanced experience. You know, there's a lot of randomness in there. So I think it's possible to have a very fun experience that's not balanced.
Even inside the context of RTS?
I think so, yeah, because I think it adds an element of drama to it. I think there's an element of like drama and excitement and having to deal with the hand that you're dealt, which makes things interesting and forces you to use tools in new ways and interesting ways that you hadn't necessarily planned for. You know, if you're capping a point with a mortar team, they're not very good at capping points, but sometimes needs must, so you've got to do it, right?
I think it ultimately.
Go on,
sorry.
Brandon.
For me, I think it ultimately depends on how you're going to define balance.
Yeah.
So for me, when I think of a balanced experience, not necessarily have the damage tables in the game be balanced in some way, but to me, a balanced experience is one where you have options, because if the experience isn't balanced, there's one best choice, and even if you're going to lose, still you have to do that one thing, and to me, balance is more than the one thing I can do is reasonably has a reasonable chance of success against the one thing you can do. So long as we're each only doing one thing, if we only have one real choice, that to me is the lack of balance. It comes out to you can't do a variety of things. You're kind of stuck doing one thing, even if that thing does well against whatever you're fighting. So that to me, in that sense, balance is very important in a strategy game, because you want the players to be able to pursue a lot of different strategies. and to use a lot of different units. You see, I've been playing a lot of Command & Conquer Remastered lately, and basically the only thing you can do is throw tanks at people.
Yes.
Or maybe if you're being really aggressive, you can throw grenadiers at them. And to me, that's the lack of balance, is that I can't go try to do mammoth tanks because I'm never going to get them out. I'm only going to pull out, as Nod, I'm only going to pull out artillery if I'm already winning. So to me, the game functions in that you can kind of win as GDI and you can play and you can have a good time, but it's not really balanced in that you can't really do a lot of different things. I've actually seen some players lately do some crazy stuff. Like there was this one game I saw recently where the player pulled out like 5 orcas right in the beginning of the match. And that was fun. And it was like, wow, I actually get to see orcas being used. So to me, in that sense, anyway, I know I've been talking for kind of a long time, but the way I think about balance is it's very important, because without it, the game just isn't going to be interesting.
That's a really good example to use Command & Conquer Remastered, because there is a alternative to Red Alert that's balanced. It's called OpenRA. You can download that, and it's a Red Alert fan project, and it actually is balanced. And I think it's really fun. I think it's really good because you can do different things. There's orcas and infantry and artillery, and all these units serve a function.
Do you think it's possible to have true balance? Is there any RTS out there that is truly balanced?
I think that's where the trap comes in, because we've seen with Starcraft, even with Legacy of the Void, they've been tweaking the game in large and small ways for many years now. And actually there's some people I know that argue that they do that on purpose to keep the game as fresh as possible. But I think there's always something that's going to feel a little too powerful or feel a little too weak. So in that sense, I do agree that the endless pursuit of balance, it needs to kind of reasonably stop somewhere. And I imagine at some point Legacy of the Void is going to stop being patched by Blizzard, and at that point, whatever's there, people are going to live with, or they'll just do a bunch of mods for it and use those instead. But yeah, I think that the pursuit of balance kind of ends up being like a mouse wheel, a hamster wheel.
Yeah.
So you keep pedaling on it endlessly. I'm tweaking this stat up, I'm tweaking that stat down. This has to be 2 seconds longer. The cooldown for this has to be 45 seconds instead of 42 or something. So I think in the Blizzard style pursuit of mechanical perfection, I think that gets a little too much. But I feel like the number of games, especially the number of RTS that really end up doing that is pretty small.
Yeah, most of them don't have the budget to perpetually balance. Most of them just, sorry, budget's gone, next game. And like with Command & Conquer, you look at Kane's Wrath, it had 2 patches, 1.01 and 1.02, and that's it.
Yeah.
I think that unfortunately happens too often with RTS. I think like... Oh, go ahead.
Sorry. I think the important point that sort of you touched on there is, I think there's like this pursuit of esports quality balance. Everything needs to be balanced for like a hyper competitive level, to not give anyone an advantage, or not to give anyone like a no-brainer like meta strategy. And I think that's where the fun starts to come out of it. Start tuning some of the fun out of it, because it wouldn't be fair in like a competitive environment, but it would be fun to use in just a casual environment.
I think what's an important word that may be more useful, because balance is a very broad word, and so it's easy to talk past each other. I think what Aiden's critique is not that balance is a problem. I think his premise is that balance often can lead to blandness, and blandness is the ultimate problem in the end of the day. And then so how do we create balance without blandness? And I think
like homogenization.
Yeah, there are, like, some games do this, some games don't. Like, I think you could argue that Starcraft 2 is pretty balanced, and yet it isn't very bland. The units are quite unique and quirky, and the factions are unique and quirky. But then I think you can get some games that just feel a bit bland, and it isn't necessarily because of balance, but balance maybe isn't helping.
Yeah, so for example, actually, one good example of that, I think, is Active Aggression. I don't know if either of you played that, but the designers of that game, it seems like they were very, very careful to kind of give all players all of the tools that they could work with, which, even though each faction had a different tech tree and they had a Command and Conquer-esque style of, or concept of build radius. So like each faction, they had different layouts for their bases, because some factions had to have their bases really kind of clumped up together around their some of their structures, and some of them could kind of spread out more. But what ended up happening is, in the later game, everyone was working with the same tools, and you might have one unit that in one faction, one capability comes earlier in the game, and another faction gets that same capability later in the game. But at the end of the day, you're all kind of just working with the same stuff. That was one common criticism I heard. And I don't know. I never really got involved in the multiplayer to a deep degree, so I don't know whether or not it's considered balanced. But when I think of blandness, unfortunately, I hate to crap on the game too much, but that was definitely a problem with it, is that you didn't get these Blizzard style, or even late Command and Conquer style, where you've got factions that actually function differently and give you different tools to play with.
I mean, the most balanced game of all is chess, right? It's like you got the two identical sides, and it sort of prompts an interesting question, which is, at the highest levels of competitive play, like the top tier of Starcraft, how often do you see mirror matches? And when you do see mirror matches, how often do they go for like the same sort of build order and the same strategy?
Well, I think it's an interesting point to distinguish between StarCraft 1 and StarCraft 2, because they are balanced very differently. And people praise Brood War for its amazing balance, that decades later they haven't released a balance patch. And so what they mean by that is that the factions are balanced, is that Zerg is not a stronger or weaker faction than Protoss. However, I think StarCraft Brood War is extremely poorly balanced, because you have units that are just absolutely awful, like the Scout. You never build a Scout in any matchup ever. But then also you have units that only fill one specific role in one specific matchup, and that's it. So you have the Firebat. The Firebat, you use it against Zerglings, but that's it. You won't use it against Terran or Protoss. And then, even aside from against Zerg, Marines also counter Zergling anyway, so it's really superfluous of what it does. And then it's completely inflexible against larger units because of the way the damage modifiers work. So then in the barracks, you have 3 units. You have both the Marine, the Firebat, and the Ghost, all of which are good against Zergling. So that's just the Firebat is a really badly balanced unit. And then other matchups, you don't build you don't build Hydras against Terran, for example.
What about
most of the time you don't.
What about StarCraft 2?
StarCraft 2 is well balanced, because in basically every matchup, basically every unit's viable. I can build Liberators against Terran, Protoss, Zerg. I can go mech, or I can go bio in Terran, Zerg, or Protoss. You can kind of do everything, and that's obviously designed very intentionally. And maybe there's exceptions. Maybe battle cruisers aren't particularly good against Zerg, but for the most part, it's miles ahead of Brood War in terms of how viable every unit is in every matchup, and that was obviously an intention, and you can tell that they've done that on purpose.
So when we're talking about balance and when we're talking about how many options you have, I actually think that the mirror matchups in StarCraft 2 are a pretty good object lesson. And my examples might be kind of out of date because I haven't really kept up to it, up with it too much lately. But my recollection is that, at least for a long time, Terran, basically every player was just doing the same thing. Was that not the case? I believe that Terran ended up just kind of doing mech most of the time, and then you're just whoever's implementing on the mech better ends up winning. Where with Protoss, and I'm pretty sure this is still the case, anything can happen. You have all of these crazy units that are crazy powerful, and you have people go air, and it's just this constant crazy wild back and forth cheese. And a lot of people don't like Protoss because it's so volatile and because it's so unpredictable, and it's so easy to have your whatever you're doing be blind countered by your enemy. But to me, that's a lot more interesting, both to play and to watch. When it comes down to with Zerg and Terran, it feels a lot more like your entire game is about the brute resource efficiency of what you're doing. If you're Zerg and you get behind on drones, you're probably not going to win, especially if it's earlier on in the match. But with Protoss, you always have something literally insane you can do. Warp Prism, Dark Templar, or even the crazy Warp Prism Immortal Micro. There's just always something wild going on in Protoss matches, and I know that the conventional wisdom is that Protoss is the least fun or the most annoying mirror matchup, but that's what I think of when I think of balance in terms of options. There's always something crazy you can do, and that's actually one thing I kind of like about Command and Conquer in general. Is I feel like, in my perspective, the CNC games, they give players the most space to have something crazy happen later in the match. It doesn't often happen. You get a lot of CNC games that are like 3 minutes long, because then you get an APC engineer rush or something.
Yeah.
Even in Kane's Wrath, you can get an APC engineer rush and grab their con yard before they have anything, and then you don't get air units this match, and then I win. But in the longer games, you could be 15 minutes into the game, you lose your only con yard, and you just keep playing. And I know that I'm getting a little off topic, I guess. But
well, I think it's relevant to the idea of blandness. I think blandness is the real enemy here. And Legacy of the Void, just touched on what you said briefly, is an interesting example, because Legacy of the Void adds units that are like really, quote unquote unbalanced. Like they're not bland units. Like the Disruptor. Like, how many times have you seen a Disruptor kill 600 Marines worth of units in a single shot, 600 minerals worth of units in a single shot, and the Liberator, and they get the Zerg, the Lurker. So they're very quirky units. I think what would be useful, Aiden, is to identify a game. So let's go with like a real world example. What is a game that you feel specifically suffers from too much emphasis on balance / blandness? Because I can think of good counter examples. Like I think Red Alert 2 and Dawn of War Dark Crusade, these amazingly popular classic games, they're not balanced games. And Dark Crusade does some interesting things where it has unit caps as a way of glossing over the fact that the clearly is not balanced. Like Grey Knights are not a balanced unit, but they are because there's a unit cap. And unit caps themselves aren't very fun, but it allows them to field unbalanced units.
Yeah, and I think the example that sort of prompted this sort of topic the last time we were talking, as I was talking about Company of Heroes. So there's a couple of things, right? There's unit to unit balance, and there's also like skill as a component of balance, and then there's also like environmental or randomized factors, sort of wild card things on the battlefield that tie into balance. And I think the example that I used was, I was playing Company of Heroes 1, and I was the Wehrmacht, and I was playing against, I think it was like an American player. No, Brits. It was definitely Brits because there were trenches, and I was getting destroyed by all objective measures. The other player was way better than me, and I had nothing left. And when all of his tanks were rolling across a bridge, I did like one last desperate sort of off-map artillery strike, and it happened to take out the bridge, and all of his tanks fell into the river, and that's it. His like entire army was wiped out. So from that point on, I was just putting Knight's Cross in trenches, and they would not die, because it's like, once a upgraded Knight's Cross is in a trench, it's not going anywhere. And it got me thinking a lot, because like, if that had been a more like quote unquote like balanced experience, I wouldn't have been able to do that. But because of the fact that I was able to, one, like wipe out pretty much an entire tank column with a lucky strike on a environmental like prop, and two, sort of chuck a load of infantry in bunkers, I was able to win. And it's like, it wasn't balanced, but it gave me like a really cool anecdote and a really cool story. And I think those are the things that we risk losing in the quest for sort of more balanced experiences, if that makes sense.
Yeah, but I think what's also useful to throw in is the term fairness. I think perhaps you can distinguish between fairness and balance, because balance brings to mind a spreadsheet. It brings to mind DPS charts and values in cost efficiency, and like that's what balance often evokes in people. But fairness is obviously a good thing. Like who wouldn't want fairness? And I would argue that example is fair, because in Company of Heroes, when you call down an artillery strike, there's like that red smoke that plays, and so the enemy can see that there's artillery. They can hear it because there's audio cues that you hear the artillery shells in the background, and also them going on the bridge was them making a decision that so long as the map is balanced around having alternative pathways, which surely it does, then they're being punished for their decision and their inability to respond given those cues. And the bridge is one example, and very similar to the bridge is the ice mechanic in Company of Heroes 2, where you can move your tanks on the ice, and if they get hit by explosives, they sink. And that's not balanced. You can spend 25 munitions to throw a grenade, and my rifle squad now sinks your heavy tiger. Like, that's not balanced. You can't look at a mathematical chart and see that's balanced. But it is the consequence of a player making a decision to send his tiger on the ice rather than spending the extra 15 seconds to path around the long way. So I think that it's fair, and I think fair is the metric that one of the important metrics for how you should gauge what balance is.
So you'd never, I mean, the examples that we just made, you never would see those in a competitive sort of top tier esport type battle, right?
Like Starcraft, like Age of Empires. I mean, with the RTS space, it's kind of hard because there isn't many examples.
Well, so in terms of esports, I think it's fair to say Age of Empires 2 and Starcraft 2 are probably your benchmark games for that sort of thing. And Starcraft 2, to an extent, will let you have an interaction that kind of feels like that. For instance, a dropship full of expensive units. That dies, and you lose all of the units inside of it. But it's interesting that both of you are saying that the tank being on ice or the tanks being on the bridge and dying to something that's designed to destroy those is not a balanced interaction. And I'm not necessarily disagreeing. I just feel like it's reasonable to question that. So if we're talking about balance in terms of I spend X resources and you spend X resources, and then the only thing that matters is skill, I'm not sure very many games are balanced 100% like that. What you spend the resources on and what you can do with those resources, it varies. That's why there's different units. In theory, a perfectly balanced game would have maybe 1 or 2 or 3 different unit types, and I don't think anyone would ever really find that interesting. Then
No.
we're getting right back into chess territory, where there's very, very few unit types, and they all do exactly one thing. And
Except the pawn, which does many things.
And the queen, which is usually considered one of the more valuable pieces in the chess game.
OP. Yeah.
Queen's OP, nerf queens.
So a question I got then is, when you look at if we say for the sake of argument that Starcraft 2 and Age of Empires 2 were the sort of pinnacle of like balance, or just the examples that we use as like highly competitive sort of like esport titles, if you think of like the average battle and then you've got like player 1 and player 2, and it's almost like a needle that sort of moves back and forth between whoever's winning. In the average like esport match, does the needle tend to like move a little bit and then flop to one side, or just like gradually go to one player, or would it wildly pendulum swing back and forth between the two players, if that makes sense?
I think it'll be minor. Yeah. I mean, I'm
not an expert on Age of Empires, but in StarCraft, usually once that pendulum swings one way, it's not going to swing back the other way very often.
Yeah, and I think that's really sort of the crux of it. It's like, if this sort of crude and metaphorical device, if we call it like the drama meter, the more that pendulum swings, the more exciting it is for both parties, right? And it's sort of like in everyone's best interest for that pendulum to swing quite wildly. But my sort of theory is that in highly competitive, highly balanced games, it sort of twitches left and right a little bit, and then it just starts to lean over to one side, and there's a tipping point, and then it just flops down to the other side.
Yeah.
I'm not sure if that's a balance thing per se.
It's a snowball
that
thing.
Seems like,
and I did talk about this
specifically for, and you've talked about snowballing before in your very well done articles and videos. But to me, so going back to Command and Conquer as an example, in most Command and Conquer games, and I'm mostly familiar, I've been watching more than anything a lot of Kane's Wrath and Red Alert 3 lately, and now getting kind of back into Command and Conquer Remastered. What impresses, what not impresses, like I'm excited about it, but it's like literally like an imprinted on my mind, is that in those games everything is very high impact. A handful of minigunners, if they go undetected, can kill a building. A single engineer can turn a match around. It doesn't take very much in Command and Conquer to have that pendulum swing back and forth. And in fact, in Red Alert 3, I think they were specifically designing for that sort of wild pendulum swinging. I lose my whole army, you lose your whole army.
Yeah.
And I lose all of my harvesters, and then you kill my MCV. And I just feel like that is. And I hesitate to say that they're not balanced. I hesitate to say that they are balanced, because the community is still releasing balanced patches. But freaking Mecha Tengus. I would say, if I were given the task of rebalancing Red Alert 3, one of the first things I would look at would be the Tengu.
The real problem is dishonorable discharge more so than the Tengu itself. Like, being you suicide the harvesters. That's really OP.
Well, it's just such a versatile unit.
Yeah.
So you forced your opponent to build anti-ground and anti-air, and then you have one big ball of things that can either be anti-ground or anti-air at any given time. So you can overwhelm the one of them and then overwhelm the other one, and then you've won. See, that to me is an example of an unbalanced interaction, because it inherently favors the player who's using the Tengus, because I'm either going to have more resources than you to build more units, so my two little balls of anti-ground and anti-air can deal independently with whichever you need your Tengus to be at the moment. that was also one of my concerns with Dawn of War 3 and the balance of that game. And of course, we have to mention Dawn of War 3 just because it makes people upset to think about. But
Yeah. I think
the
like
Space Marines, though, the Space Marines were very versatile. They had units they could literally like call off map and then call back in anywhere they wanted to. So you were able to take these theoretically not really big deal type things, and then I can be where you're not, or you think there's an encounter that you can win, and oops, all of a sudden there's a ton of units there that there weren't before. And I feel like that sort of thing is not properly accounted for sometimes in the balanced data. And again, though, the Red Alert 3, the Tango, I think is a good example of that. It's just a unit that's too versatile, and that's the problem. It's
like the Raven in Starcraft 2 currently. The Raven can just do like 12 different things.
I think skill's a really important component there, because sometimes things are balanced, but the skill required to use them is much lower, and it makes them feel like they're
like Dark
unbalanced.
Templars, especially
or
in
like
Starcraft 2.
Banshees in, I forget which, in like a Chaos. What was the Chaos expansion for Dawn of War 2?
Howling
Chaos
Banshees.
Rising.
Chaos Rising, yeah, like the Howling Banshees. Whenever we used to play, everyone would be like, "Oh, the Banshees were overpowered," and it's like, they're not. It's just the skill required to counter them is much higher than the skill required to use them. It's like right-click on the target and they'll cut through anything pretty much. But the skill required to like keep microing your units around to kite them makes it really, really challenging. And I think that's one of the things, right? It's like, can you ever really have true balance? And if you do have it, is it the best thing for the majority of players?
Well, I think balance, there is no objective balance, obviously, because it's not a mathematical formula. It's based on player experience, and players are subjective. So no, you can't. But it's degrees of balance is, if you go back and play StarCraft 2 launch day, Wings of Liberty day 1, that just is obviously a lot worse balance compared to Legacy of the Void in 2020. And same with Company of Heroes 2. If you play day 1 launch of Company of Heroes 2 compared to 2020 Company of Heroes 2, the balance is miles ahead. And as a result, it's more fun for everyone. The fact that they've balanced these games for 10 or 7 years is to the benefit. However,
do you think?
Well, yeah, you can never finalize balance and tick it on a box.
Do you think that balance is important to a fun experience?
Yeah, because I think as what Brandon was saying, balance is diversity of strategy. It's variation.
I would say to a point. So for instance, with the Howling Banshees, yeah, it's possible to deal with them, but the player who's using them probably ultimately isn't having as much fun as they could be having, because they just build a bunch of Howling Banshees and right click, and then they just wait. And then the other player is, again, not having as much fun as they could be having, because they know that the Howling Banshees are probably, but not definitely, coming. And if they do come, they are going to have to work much, much harder than their opponent just to stand a chance of winning. So I think that's the sort of thing that your balance should primarily be in pursuit of, is in most cases the risk of doing something and the reward of doing something should be kind of in parity. So if it's easy to do, it shouldn't be really, really easy to win with. You should be required to work a little bit with whatever tools you're using to win. And I think that's probably for me anyway, that's the baseline in terms of balance, is that you get these risks and rewards sorted out such that it gives both players an opportunity to have, or both teams an opportunity to have fun. Let's say, just for instance, Dark Templar had 3 times as much health, or cost half as much, or came out 45 seconds earlier. I don't know that improves the fun of the game, because then the proto player is always going to go for Dark Templars, and the other players are going to be forced to get detection as early as possible, and then the game becomes: do I get an undetected Dark Templar in your base? If I do, I win, and if I don't, it's no big deal, and you have to keep fighting as though I hadn't done that, because it's so easy for me to get undetected Dark Templars into your base. I don't think the game becomes more fun in that situation. Maybe for a couple of viewers for a while, it's interesting because you have this crazy scramble over Dark Templar. But I think ultimately what RTS designers are looking for is a game where both players have multiple options they can pursue and have to execute skillfully on to make sure that something happens. And it becomes kind of like fencing, where it's, parry and riposte, and it's this dance almost. And if it's, I don't know, I stopped because I started thinking about Warcraft 3, so I kind of lost my train of thought.
I wanted to say something. I think just quickly, balance is an umbrella term, and there are subcomponents, subcategories. There's faction balance, like Starcraft Brood War is faction balanced. You have diversity and variety of viable units and strategies and play styles. So Starcraft 2 does that pretty well. And then I think third, you have, is it balanced between skill levels and game modes and map types? Like the balance in a 1v1 game is obviously going to be different to a 4v4, but in an ideal world, balance would be consistent throughout skill levels and map sizes and map types. And you can look at some interesting examples in Company of Heroes to see where that isn't the case.
Yeah, I think I sort of look at it like Overwatch, right? In Overwatch, you've got all these different heroes and they all do different things. And there's certain matchups that are just not gonna work out well for you. It's like you've got a hero that's not great against the hero that you're coming up against. And I think that's okay. I think it's okay to have these sort of counters that just, if you're really, really good, you can sort of get away with it and you can sort of win and it feels great. And but for the average person, they're just never gonna win that matchup. And I think that allows players to have or developers to create things that are a lot more characterful and a lot more interesting. And I think it's the pursuit of the mechanical and mathematical balance that tends to sort of homogenize things, because you don't want to give someone an unfair advantage for just picking the right character or just happening to pick the cool unit.
It's interesting because I don't want to use the wrong term. I almost said deck building games, and I know that's a specific subgenre because I've had a lot of people on my Discord yell at me about that. So, but trading card games, anyway, like Magic the Gathering or Hearthstone, they don't have to worry as much about specific balance between all of their various options. They just throw a crap ton of options at you and try to make sure that some of the worst ones aren't so bad after a while. I think that's sort of a game. For a while, I played this turn-based tactics game, this turn-based trading card game called Duelist. Unfortunately, I think it shut down this year or last year. And there's a fan reboot, but you had some crazy stuff you could do in Duelist with two factions that could just spend and spawn endless numbers of units, and then some factions that could get a unit out for very little cost. But if the egg lasts 3 turns, then it turns to this horrible, unstoppable juggernaut. And those games were all about giving players just a ton of really, really powerful ways to just dick each other over. Sorry, maybe I shouldn't. Maybe we're family friendly.
Think of the children. It's really interesting. I'm glad you brought up Magic and CCGs, because that was going to be something else. I was like,
I don't want to, before we before we go too far into that, another example actually is MOBAs. So Dota and League of Legends, they have the same thing where there are some heroes that are just never going to do anything against other heroes. And to me, what they've done that actually makes it really interesting as a spectator, like I played Dota a couple of years ago, but kind of fell out of it. But as a spectator of Dota, what I really, really love watching is the pick ban phase of the game. I love that. I love like watching the mind games as they ban this and then sneak this heroine that they want to use for their composition, and oh no, they banned one of the heroes that goes with him, so you've got to figure out some alternate. Like that's half the fun of the match for me is watching the pick ban phase in a Dota 2 game. Like they don't have to have each individual hero balanced against all the others, so long as they give players a tool to work that to their advantage, which might be something you would consider a possibility to somehow happen in an RTS game where there's some sort of, if there's imbalances that are baked in, giving players some sort of tool, not necessarily a pre-match pick ban, like, oh, I'm going to ban you from ghosts and you're going to say I can't use High Templar or something. But that sort of thinking where you have this kind of known block in your game design that you can't get around, so you allow players to game around that block in some meaningful way. You give them a series of choices they can make that deal with the big block of imbalance you're stuck with. And for Dota 2 anyway, I think it worked really, really well to create this actually exciting experience where you're mind gaming the other team before the match even starts.
Yeah, now we're getting into like the meat of it, because it's like games like Magic and games like Dota and League of Legends and what have you. It's like, would you say that the average game of Magic is like balanced? And can you even balance an experience when there's so many cards? Like the ban list, the list of banned cards for Magic compared to the amount of cards that are in Magic is tiny. And maybe that's the thing, right? In like traditional sort of RTS games, they're sort of fairly self-contained. You got 3 factions, and every faction needs to have enough tools in the toolbox to solve all the challenges that can come up against it. But because all the factions need all the tools, and you can't have too many units in one faction, like, I keep using the word homogenous. Like, I know Zerg and Terran and Protoss aren't, they're not the same, but you're going to see the same type of units, the same, like...
The Lurker is like the Siege Tank is like the Disruptor.
Yeah.
So that actually is one complaint I've heard from some more strident people who follow Starcraft 2 is that now that the balance is better, they achieved that by giving Zerg a ground-based artillery unit that isn't really exactly like the siege tank, but functions somewhat similarly.
Because it's faster than stimmed Marines, because concrete.
Yeah. So one of the ways that Starcraft 2 became more balanced was to homogenize the individual options that each player was working with depending on the faction that they have. So you still have some very big differences between, like you said, between the Zerg and the Protoss, but now Zerg and Protoss have more of an overlapping toolset than they did back in Heart of the Swarm or even in Wings of Liberty. So I do see what you're saying by forcing a bit more homogeny to achieve a better balance. And I also used the example earlier of active aggression, which felt like it was way too homogenous because everyone had exactly the same options at the end of the day.
Yeah. And I think that's really what it comes down to. Like, if you think of a game like League of Legends or Magic versus a traditional RTS. A traditional RTS is like an army in a box. You've got everything there. But in League of Legends, like, your team is your army. And sometimes your army composition is just going to be better in all scenarios against the enemy's team composition. Like, if you run into the wrong matchup in your lane, there's sort of like, if you're really, really good, you can do something about it. But 9 times out of 10, or like, unless you're really, really good, the person who's picked the other thing is going to come out on top. And
Well, I think it's also important to say that sometimes in that situation, being really, really good is to know to get out of that lane and switch with someone else. Just a minor point, but just to demonstrate that we're not always talking about exactly the same kinds of skills that lead to success. So fighting better isn't necessarily always the best option.
It's mechanics as
knowing
opposed
when
to
to run away,
decision
knowing
making.
when to cut your losses.
Yeah.
I think in not only in RTS but in any sort of longer term competitive game, with some sort of build up phase. I think
I think games like Overwatch and League, it's interesting to take a step back and rather than getting bogged down in the nitty gritty, because is balance fun? I mean, that it asks the question of what is balance, but also what is fun. And there's multiple different types of fun. Someone actually pointed this out in my Discord. But there's fun in terms of mastery. So practicing the same build order, perfecting it, winning in Starcraft 2, getting to Masters League. That's mastery, and that's fun. But also novelty is fun, of Comp Stomp versus AI, the visual eye candy of playing No Rush 20, and you build up a big army, and your big army's smashed. Like, that's fun. People enjoy that. People also enjoy the power fantasy of the experimental Galactic Colossus in Supreme Commander, and now the Colossus is just killing everything because it's really overpowered because it's an endgame unit. So there's different types of fun, and you can look at what games are aiming for, and so you can compare Overwatch to Fortnite to Counter-Strike. All three of those games are extremely successful, popular, and fun games, but they're fun in different ways. Counter-Strike is fun because it's a game about mastery. It's an incredibly skillful game. The skill ceiling is very high. It's very hard to play. You can't luck your way through it, or you're going to have a hard time doing so. And the balance is pretty tight. Well, arguably it is, arguably it isn't, because you just use AKs and M4s the whole game. You don't use that many weapons, but like, it seems like a pretty self-evident statement that Counter-Strike is more balanced than Overwatch. I think that kind of speaks for itself. Every player does the same thing, really. Apart from
that's a really good point.
One guy has a sniper.
Do you think that I'm trying to think of a better way to phrase it, but like, I don't think a lot of developers have the money to come up with an experience that's as balanced as Starcraft is, just because the sheer amount of like time and play testing and iteration, and to get something that tight and that well balanced, not everyone's got the time or the resources to do that. And maybe what some of the problem is that everyone's striving for this esport quality sort of like balance or experience, but it's a lot harder than it looks to get there, and it requires like a lot of time and a lot of playtesting and a lot of iteration. And so like, people are trying to go down that road, but they're not always necessarily able to pull it off, just because they haven't got like however many years, however many decades of experience of making the same game with hundreds of thousands or like millions of people playing it day in, day out.
The way I look at it is, in addition to different types of fun, there's different types of frustration, and there's different ways in which the players are going to be frustrated. So the guy that you beat in Company of Heroes that one time, I bet he was pretty frustrated when he lost all of his tanks. And to me, as a game designer, you have to look at, because you're always going to frustrate somebody, especially in a competitive game. And to me, what it comes down to is, how often is a player going to feel like the situation was unfair? How often is the player going to feel like there was no point in trying to play after a certain point? To me, it's about minimizing the surface area of those frustrations more than it is about trying to eliminate them. So for me, for balance, it's how often are you okay with letting players feel screwed over? Because it's going to happen. It's always going to happen. I mean, think about Idra back in the day. I don't think he's around anymore in StarCraft, but but he's the archetype of that sort of player. Every loss was a catalog of all of the things that he was upset about. There's actually a guy in Command & Conquer Remastered that kind of does the same sort of thing. Probably should. I was going to say his name, but I realized I probably shouldn't. But there's a lot of players out there that do that. If they lose, it's not because they didn't play well to them. It's not because they were outplayed. The other person got lucky or capitalized on a small mistake or something. It's that the game is broken. It's the designer's fault. It's the studio's fault. It's the game's fault. And you're always gonna have that. But the to me, looking more than just at what's fun about the game, but what's frustrating about the game and what feels unfair and what feels crappy to have happened to you, I think is a good way to address that sort of a concern. So full disclosure, I play a couple of those mobile.
Yeah.
What would you call them?
Unedifying cow flickers.
Like Clash Royale is kind
Oh.
of the archetype of that sort of. So that
Yeah,
you
there's
kind
a
of build a
term
deck of
for it.
units and you place
Yeah.
them on the. Yeah, I don't remember what they're called. Tug of war games. Is that what they're called? Where you kind of place the unit and it marches across the battlefield.
Yeah,
all on its
yeah.
own. I play a couple of those, and you're always good. There's definitely ways to build really suboptimal and really more optimal decks, and I have thought about the problem of trying to add content to an RTS that's that flexible, and it always kind of crashes into the reality of how RTS are played and the scale and the scope. And I think that's why some developers have tried to kind of you get complaints, of course, from people saying, oh, modern RTS, the people are trying to take out base building and trying to take out resourcing, and I think that's not actually exactly true. I've played a lot of the major RTS releases, and like I still feel like 80% of RTS are still pretty traditionally designed.
Yeah.
But anyway, the ones that aren't, though, I think sometimes those developers are trying to not only square the circle of frustrating players less learning the game, but sometimes it's, how can we get new content? How can we do an evergreen content? It never seems to work, and I'm not sure it's related directly to balance as much as it is to the expectations of the player base.
Yeah, something Callum said earlier about the different types of fun I think is very important, because if you're deriving fun from mastery, you kind of need a level playing field. It goes back to the chess example, right? Like, the closer you are to chess, the more your victory is through your skill alone than it is through the roll of the dice. And that's fine. And that's like that. I think that serves a very small audience of people, like in the scheme of things. And Clash Royale's a really great example, because the thing is if you lose at Clash Royale, like, one, it doesn't really matter because the sessions are so short that you don't beat yourself. You haven't spent like 30 minutes basically. You spend like 3 minutes or whatever the timer is on it. There's the card element as well. So if you lose, you can always be like, yeah, the cards were against me. Like, they got some really good units. I don't even have that goblin, which helps because it's like freemium as well, and sort of like drives people towards like buying card packs or buying loot chests or whatever the sort of like monetization method is. And I think it really comes down to like who your audience is, right? Like, do you want to make something that everyone can enjoy and have a good time, or do you want to make something that's like for fewer people who are going to be like way more heavily invested in it?
Well, I think that's the elegance of MOBAs, is that it does cater to everyone, because you have and Overwatch again is the example, because in Overwatch, I don't know Overwatch very well, but let's say League of Legends, which I do know pretty well, is that there are very high skill ceiling champions generally the damage champions, like the mages that have to land these really precise spells, or these, they're called AD carries, like the marksman unit, the heroes that are very squishy, so they require much precision, and there's a lot of really important decision making about where to stand and who to attack, and so those appeal to the competitive players who want that mastery. But also inside of those games, you have the support champions, ones that some of them are difficult, but some of them are really easy, and some of those are excellent for your tag along girlfriend. Hey honey, do you want to play League of Legends with us? Oh, that sounds really hard. Nah, that's okay. You can just play Sona. When you're playing Sona, all you have to do is run around healing people. You heal people and you give them extra movement speed, or like those support roles. And you have that in Overwatch. Is it Mercy, the one that heals people? In Team Fortress 2, you have the medic. Those are very easy roles to play compared to the things like, I don't know, the Archer or the Scout in Team Fortress 2. And so by giving different people different outlets for fun, the support hero is fun because you're contributing to the team. You have that camaraderie. You have that feeling of like, yes, I saved you. I put that bubble on you, that shield on you, just as you're about to get hit by this bad spell. And that feels great. But it also feels great when you nuke the enemy team through your really twitchy mechanics.
Yeah. I think it sort of goes back to the army in the box idea, right? You need to give the player all the tools they need to counter everything, because it wouldn't be fun if you had a team of like, we're playing Company of Heroes and for whatever reason our force doesn't have any counter to mortars, and they've got all indirect fire, so they can just sit behind buildings and just shell us all day. You know, like we've only got machine guns and they've only got mortars.
Yeah.
So they're gonna win. Like, but if the session was like 15 minutes long, and you know, and if there was some randomization element to it, you know, there's 5 heroes and they've got different units, then maybe it would be a different story.
Yeah, I definitely agree with frustration being less difficult if you go into a session with the expectation that it might not be fair. Like I played Gwent, that card game, online for a while, and sometimes you just sort of don't have a good deck or whatever, and it doesn't really frustrate me that much. But then if I play something that I have the perception that it should be fair, like Company of Heroes should be a fair balanced game as an RTS, then that feels frustrating if I lose.
I can't remember who said it, but there was like a quote which was, good game design is when the player wins, they think it was because of skill, and when they lose, it's because they think it's down to bad luck.
Yeah.
Which sort of pretty much sums up like Magic the Gathering or like Hearthstone or something in a nutshell. You know, every time I lose a CCG, I'm like, oh, it's because I had mana drought. You know, like I didn't have enough mana. Or like, oh, of course they won. They pulled the insert name of like card here in the first round. In the first sort of hand. So yeah, I think that's something really important.
Yeah. And what should an RTS aim for? Because games like Starcraft are aiming for that sort of mastery. Although they also aim for campaigns too, so that's also worth qualifying, and that's what most people play, by the way, is campaigns. Most people don't even touch multiplayer to begin with. But then, even with a game like Dawn of War Dark Crusade, even if you're just kind of playing the skirmishes, but the campaigns are very popular, it isn't aimed at mastery. It's aimed at eye candy. It's aimed at cool battles. Like you have sync kills is an interesting mechanic. Is that in no way is sync kills balanced. There's a 5% chance that your unit does a cool kill.
I think the other thing that you have to consider with RTS, as opposed to something like a MOBA or something like a card game, is in I'm not super familiar with Hearthstone, but let me use the example, and I really want to see the comments on this video, because so far we've done Dawn of War 3, we've mentioned MOBAs, and we've got mobile games in here, so I can only imagine what sort of comments we're going to get.
Well, I think the people who watch podcasts tend to be a bit more learned and intellectual and open-minded than
our last podcast had some fun comments on it too. So we'll have to see. I'm excited to see what comes out of it.
Well, clickbait titles, that's what we need.
But using the example of something like Hearthstone. In Hearthstone, each player gains mana every turn, and I'm sure there's classes or cards that let you manipulate that in small ways, but most of the time the players are always working with the same amount of options, for lack of a better word. You've got the same pool of stuff
economy,
from which
right?
to draw cards. Yeah, your economy is basically forced in parity, and anytime that changes, it's because a player's made the decision to say, some of my cards are going to manipulate my economy. And the same thing happens in Clash Royale. There's like a couple of cards that let you kind of try to get some more energy a couple seconds down the line. So that's something that RTS, unless it's being played at the very, very highest levels, doesn't really do. The idea of your economy being in parity just really doesn't happen. You've got players that are turtling, and they want to, sometimes it's not possible, but these players want to sit in their base and build up a big army, and they might try to build more economy earlier. And then you've got your rushers, and they want to get the absolute bare minimum economy they can afford to be able to execute on their rush. And so right out of the gate, that doesn't apply from that. What Hearthstone is doing doesn't apply to something like Starcraft. You can't have... I think it would be very difficult to be able to slot a Hydralisk into a Terran army and see that work really, really well. Just as an idea of, Starcraft being a game where you can build a deck of units. Tooth and Tail tried that, where you can bring like 6 different units along with you into the match. And they never tried to monetize that and expand on that in any sort of way. But that's the kind of a little slice of that sort of idea. And also with MOBAs, you start out with 5 people on your team. It's not like you have to start out with one guy and train the second hero and then train the third hero, and the timing of those heroes being trained is important to the match. No, you've got all your stuff right there from the get-go. Again, RTS don't do that. So I think it's a little tricky to apply some of these lessons directly to RTS, because you never know in a game whether you're going to have 78 or 98 Marines or 23 Marines. So changing the Marine doesn't mean the same thing as changing a card in Hearthstone that you may play 3 or 4 of. Similarly, changing one hero in Dota is 1/5 or 1/8, maybe, depending on the hero power scales of your whole entire power for your team and your whole entire suite of options for your team. So yeah. These are some kind of challenges that are unique to RTS, that you have these weird proportionality differences and timing differences and economy differences, and every time a developer tries to mess with that, people get mad.
Well, yeah, I mean, that's the thing, right? It's like economy is such a large part of how people exhibit skill in more like traditional RTS games that you can't really turtle, because if you're turtling, you're not going out and getting resources, and if you're not getting resources, you're not building an army or building defenses or anything like that. And with the other games that we've mentioned, like League of Legends and Hearthstone and Clash Royale, is they basically take the economy out of the equation. And sure, League of Legends, you've got gold that you can use to buy items and what have you, but you can't get new powers, you can't get new abilities, you can't get new units. You can make the units you've got like hit harder, hit faster, like get health back. But
well, Dota's an interesting contradiction, because in Dota the items are more ability based. Like you buy an item and now it lets you teleport, and now it lets you cast Cyclone. So not to get bogged down in the difference, but Dota does. But
the hero's got 4 abilities.
Yeah.
And when you start the game to when you finish the game, you still got those 4 abilities, and like they're not gonna get significantly better. They're gonna get more powerful. Yeah, but
4 abilities versus 5 abilities, even with like Aghanim Scepter or something, that's a very different thing from one player having Zerglings to another player having battle cruisers.
Yeah.
So there's a lot more change in game state in an RTS, and I think that makes it really hard to account for some of these variables that work better in games that are scaled differently.
Yeah, should 6 Marines always beat 5 Marines? Or should there be some randomization in there to, like, mix it up? Like, is it fun if it's always a foregone conclusion?
Well, that's
Or,
why
like,
Company of Heroes is interesting, is because it's really the only RTS game that has meaningful RNG. I can't think of any other game that does, and RNG I think it's so fundamental to Company of Heroes that
Yeah, and Dawn of War, right?
Dawn of War, not really, just the way that accuracy works in Dawn of War 2, things don't miss, and that's why things have 600 health, is because, or 1,000 health, is because things never miss.
Yeah,
the only
like
real RNG is like special attacks and
when
sync
you
kills.
lose a model, right? Like sometimes you lose a model
that's
really
true. Yeah.
quickly, and sometimes you can limp out of there with like 5% health and all 3 models.
Yeah.
Yeah, and I think that adds a lot of drama. Even in mirror matches, if you've got 2 squads of scouts and you're sort of duking it out, there's always like that luck component that keeps it fresh. And if they lose a model, then you're like, yes.
I do think though for those games, especially Company of Heroes, a lot of what the gameplay ends up coming down to is trying to minimize the risk of RNG screwing you over, which is why you're going to try to bring multiple squads into a fight to get overlapping fire arcs to make sure that whatever you're fighting gets taken out, and fighting behind cover to make sure that your squads are getting hit less, and that sort of thing. And I think that definitely changes the gameplay over pretty much any other RTS, because the risk that you're minimizing is a different kind of risk than you're trying to minimize in something like Starcraft or Age of Empires. And Age of Empires, minimizing risk is building walls out of houses, which is a very different sort of a thing.
All right, you said you have to bail, Brandon?
Yeah, I didn't want to make a big deal out of it for the podcast audience, but it's getting kind of late in my neck of the woods, so...
Thanks for coming on. It was good. I mean, I'm happy to continue.
Yeah, absolutely.
Aiden,
thanks for having me.
If you're keen.
Did we crack the case?
No.
I feel like we talked in circles a lot, but it was fun.
Well, it's
I felt like we started getting into the meat of it like 20 minutes ago. We were like, now we're really drilling into it.
Yeah. Well, it's like you can't solve balance. You also can't solve the question of is balance fun, because the questions are too
I think we
vague.
did kind of hit a more or less... we hit a kind of a thesis, right? that balance in the terms of pure mechanical equity is probably an impossible and not necessarily... it might be a bit of a red herring, but balance in terms of player quality of life, I think, is thinking about it that way is important for any game that's going to have more than one player involved on different sides of the different teams.
Yeah, I think understanding what fun you're aiming for. Are you aiming for mastery? Are you aiming for novelty? Are you aiming for drama? Like, these are all important things to distinguish. And like, who are the majority of players who are buying the game? Because again, it's very easy for us to get in these esoteric conversations when 95% of RTS players only play campaigns, and then you sort of miss the market reality that actually is what the driving force behind sales is. But I think there's definitely some concepts. Like, I think making sure games aren't bland is a no-brainer. But it's difficult. I mean, it's a no-brainer in terms of it's important, but actually implementing that is difficult, because what's fair and what's not, like, those things vary. And I think the frustration thing that you mentioned, Brandon, earlier was good. I mean, I'm going to probably go on a long rant, so if you want to bail now, then now's a good time. You're off, Brandon?
Yeah, what's the way to bail that messes with your setup the least?
Oh,
Can I
that's fine.
disconnect?
Just disconnect. I
Okay.
think I'll have to redo that overlay, but that will take me like 2 seconds.
Okay. Well, thanks for having me on. It was a pleasure as always,
to meet
and
you.
I look forward to next time. Nice to meet you as well.
Yeah, see Brandon?
And yeah, have a great evening, everybody.
Thanks.
Okay, so I think now I just have to disable... No, that's me. Disable Brandon, and then I have to drag you over a bit. There you go. Fixed.
Do you need me to vamp?
What?
Do you need me to vamp? Do you need me to like?
No. There you go. The power of editing. Oh, no. Yeah. He was talking about, like, you're always going to frustrate players, and I think just as there's different types of fairness, there's different types of frustration, and not all are equal. So frustration from unfairness is a lot worse than frustration because you suck and you lost and you know it. Like, that's a different type of frustration. And I think Company of Heroes 2 is such a good example for a lot of these discussions because it really has both the example and the counter example within the same game.
Yeah.
Like, RNG, I think, is a good part of Company of Heroes. It's good that mortar strikes are wildly inconsistent depending on luck, effectively. Do you hit or do you miss? With penetration values in tank battles, do you penetrate, do you miss, or do you hit? All these things are interesting with cover and infantry. But then you have other examples that are really frustrating. So you have, for example, you put in a recon plane, and then an anti-air unit shoots down the recon plane, and then the recon plane crash lands on your army and kills your entire army, and now you lose the game. You have no army left because the recon plane killed your army. That's RNG. That's not fun. That's frustrating. You didn't do anything to deserve that loss. You didn't make a mistake. There's no learning lesson. There's no fairness. It's just the plane crashed on your infantry. Sorry, and that happens. And it's been changed, but it still happens. Not as much as it used to, or not as the explosive radius isn't as big. Like there's like YouTube compilations of like recon planes crashing on an army. It's like, it's really bad. And then at the same time, you have like the way that infantry squads can clump up, and then you have 7 conscripts that have the surface area of 1.5 conscripts. And then so what happens is an anti-tank gun shoots and somehow kills 6 conscripts with a single shot. That's like, what? Why did that happen? That's stupid. And then you lose the squad. Just RNG that should not happen and is not fun happens alongside RNG that feels like it's fair.
I think, yeah, the thing that sort of I'm taking away, having had the chance to sort of talk about it tonight, is that there's different audiences, and like the people who care about like balance in the traditional sense of the word are like the people who want to play at like a very high, very competitive level, and for them it's in their best interest for things to be largely the same, to sort of exhibit skill. And then for everyone else, they're more interested in like drama.
Yeah.
And so if you don't play multiplayer and you only play single player, balance is actually not fun, because then every mission would be the same and it would basically be like an analog of multiplayer. But you don't want that. You want the excitement curves in your campaign, right? Like level 1, it's Normandy Beach, you're vastly outnumbered, that really sucks. Then like level 3, you're in an armored tank column rolling through like a lightly defended outpost, and that feels great. You've turned the tides, and those are like not balanced in your favor in the first example, and then again balanced in your favor in the second example. And then it comes down to frustration as well. Like there's an acceptable level of time investment where people will shrug off a loss or shrug off something as not balanced because they haven't invested enough to be like super frustrated about it. But there's a magic line after like a certain period of time or after a certain amount of investment where you feel hard done by when things are not balanced, because like ostensibly your time has been wasted if something unbalanced happens. And it's interesting that all of the examples that we talked about with the slightly more like imbalanced approach to things tend to have a much shorter session length than.
So I'm gonna close my window real quick. I forgot that my window's open. I can hear like my neighbors and stuff.
It's cool.
Normally I have my windows closed, but it's summer now and it's like pretty hot.
Yeah, I think some guy in the apartment above me started drilling about 10 minutes into when we started talking.
Oh, I didn't hear it.
Oh, that's all right then. But yeah, I think like the main thing for me is just people will be more forgiving of like imbalance, as it were, if the stakes are lower.
Yeah.
And if the investment is lower, and that's not and it might even be good to have imbalance, because for every 5 times you're on the receiving end of it, the other 5 times you're the one benefiting from it. And so when there's this higher turnover of matches, it tends to like obfuscate the frustration a bit. It sort of tends to blur the lines a bit. Whereas if you play 1 or 2 games a night, you're really going to care about whether something's balanced. But if you play 10 games in a night, 10 matches in a night, you're not going to be so mad about the one time you ran into your hard counter.
This is my problem with Company of Heroes too. I think the game length is actually too long. I think it would be better if Company of Heroes maxed out effectively at 40 VPs. Sorry, 40 minutes. Rather than like
40 VPs.
Up to an hour. And Dawn of War 2 is much shorter game length. I think it's maybe a little bit too short. So I think dragging it out, like if you were to say Company of Heroes 2, the VPs was 400 VPs, not 500 VPs, like that would shorten the game length, and I think that would benefit. I think also what I've been doing lately is, I mean, the 1v1 meta in Company of Heroes is so bad currently that I've been playing just 2v2 games, and I just play with randoms on online. And even though a lot of the time I get matched up with someone who is terrible and I lose and it's his fault, it isn't really that frustrating because I'm just like, whatever, it was a random 2v2, some random teammate, he wasn't very good, that's a shame. But if I lose a 1v1 game, then I get like really frustrated because I feel like, you know, A, something's unbalanced, or B, because I've just played badly and then I feel bad. And so I think expectations are important, and that's something that both a developer can and can't control at the same time. And it is what do you think they can't control? Well,
the expectations.
it's not Relic's fault that I get angry when I lose a 1 versus 1 game, which is why I would rather play a 2 versus 2 game, because it diffuses the frustration of losing. And I think that's why most people play 4v4 games in general, like most in Company of Heroes and in most RTS games. The preferred game mode for multiplayer, aside from the fact that most people just play against the AI to begin with, is a 4v4. Or whatever the largest game mode is. Like in Dawn of War 2, it's 3v3. The largest game mode is 3v3, and that's what people play predominantly. Starcraft 2 is like the exception in that regard, which even that, more people play the co-op mode of Starcraft 2 now than what they play 1 versus 1.
So is there any RTS where you don't feel frustrated if you lose a 1v1?
That's a good question. I think it depends on a lot of things. It depends on how close the game was. Like if I have a really close game and I lose only barely, like that's not frustrating to me. It was a fun game.
That's still an awesome game.
It was an awesome game. If I lose a game, if it's a really close game and then I lose because of something that I perceive as balance, or because of some bad RNG in Company of Heroes in a way that doesn't feel fair, then that can be really frustrating. Or if I lose against someone who's just so much of a better skill than me, and I lose in 10 minutes and it feels like I had no chance, then that's not fun either. So I think, in ways it's more perhaps of a matchmaking problem. That is a big part of it too. Or which in RTS games, because the player bases are so small, it is very difficult to have good matchmaking that will match you up against similar players.
The audience's expectations, I think the reason why I keep coming back to examples like Hearthstone and Overwatch and stuff like that is I think they did a really good job of what's the word I'm looking for? Like, kind of resetting what the audience's expectations are of those experiences. The sort of traditional CCG or like traditional like shooter. There's a lot of what's the word I'm looking for? Like, the audience has a certain expectation of like what they should be and how people should like almost feel when you win or lose, right? Like, very competitive, very serious, no frivolity, no like random randomized things going on.
Yeah, I really like that example. What was the when a good game design is when you win, it feels like because of skill. When you lose, it's because of luck. And a lot of board games do this as well. There's a lot more luck in board games than there generally is in computer games, unless you look at a card game like Hearthstone, because Hearthstone effectively is a board game on a computer. So it has that same sort of distribution of skill and luck and chance and whatnot. Yeah,
and taking economy out of the equation, I think, is a really big part of it, because it leads to like that snowballing. Once you start to lose, like, the rich get richer, and by taking the economy out of the equation, it allows the player to like focus on the toys instead of focusing on the sort of
the
numbers.
chores, the nitty gritty of building supply depots and building workers.
You don't have to worry about, in a traditional RTS, you've got like 3 tech tiers, and when you get to tier 3, you unlock like all the powerful toys, but it doesn't matter if you haven't got the resources to use them, right? But in Hearthstone, you can pull your most powerful card and you're like, oh yeah, I'll hold on to that because I can use it in like 3 turns time.
Yeah, well, to think of a summary, I think you want things to be fair, but you don't want things to be bland, and things feel fair if like you lost because you made a mistake of some kind. At least in an RTS setting. I'm not talking about like Hearthstone here. Hearthstone.
Yeah.
We can talk all we want about MOBAs and card games. RTSs are very, very different. Things need to be fair, and so like the ice mechanic, like that's a good example. Ice and bridges and whatever, like that's how the things that are exciting and dramatic, but also are fair at the same time. And things like the heavy artillery strikes in Company of Heroes, those things are dramatic and they can kill a lot of stuff. They give you that power fantasy, and yet also they're fair because, like, A, they're expensive, B, they have a delay and they telegraph they're about to happen. Or you have these super big heavy tanks like the Elephant Heavy Tank Destroyer that feels really powerful. It really doesn't feel balanced because it completely decimates enemy armor on the field. But it is fair because it has no attack versus infantry, and you can flank it and it rotates very slowly. Or like just even more basic, a heavy machine gun team is it devastates infantry in the front in its arc, but it gets flanked, it gets forced off. So you have these ways of countering all of these tools and all of these abilities, whatever they are. So they're fair, but also they're not bland. They're all very impactful in their own way. and in each specific situation they can have a massive impact on the battlefield, which is like what Brandon was saying with like the engineer and the APC. Like it's kind of cheesy, but it's very high impact, and high impact units is what makes them feel like exciting and dramatic. So just the drama is what you want to aim for. However, so in that sense, yes, balance is overrated, but at the same time, bad balance isn't in and of itself fun. And
Yeah.
there are games that are not bland and are exciting, but also suffer from bad balance. And you could improve the balance without negatively impacting the excitement and the drama. And so you could look at Command and Conquer Generals, where you have, in the USA faction, you have 20 units. And how many of them do you build? 3. You build the Humvee, you build the rocket soldier, you build an ambulance, and maybe a Pathfinder. Like that, you only build 4 units out of the entire arsenal that this faction has to offer. And that's not fun. You could have the balance improve, and you would still have all of that quirkiness, all of the wackiness, all of the drama that makes 0 Hour so fun. But you would improve that. And even though it is unbalanced, it's still fun because the amount of interaction and depth with all of those units is still really huge. It's the same with Brood War. Starcraft Brood War are in a mirror matchup where you're only building 3 or 4 units, but it's still really interesting. And there's a lot of variety and depth within the build orders and the positionings and how you play the matchup, even if the unit roster is limited. But again, for the majority of players, they're playing at a skill level or in a game mode, a single player, or even just a 4v4, where the balance doesn't really matter. So that's my summary.
So what we're saying
I suppose.
is balance doesn't mean it's fun, but it also means it doesn't mean it's not fun. It is important to fun, but also not important to fun. Is that what we're saying?
Yeah, I think to be precise, blandness is obviously the big boogeyman, which can be conflated with balance. I mean, it is hard to identify. Like, I think arguing the position of balance is overrated. It is difficult because it's very easy to see when things are unbalanced and when they're not fun. But it's very difficult to see when something is bland and how, like, the lost idea that was scrapped because it wouldn't be balanced. Like, you don't know what you don't have. And so what ideas were tossed out of StarCraft 2 because it was overpowered, for example.
Yeah.
And so
throwing out, it's like, the throwing out of things that are fun in the pursuit of, like, balance, essentially.
Yeah, and you can look at games like Red Alert 3, and especially with the expansion they had, Uprising, which doesn't have multiplayer. So it was only single player, and it has these really crazy, really overpowered units that probably couldn't happen in multiplayer. So, yeah, I don't know. I think it's also a bit of a misleading statement to say that everyone's trying to do esports. Like, I don't think that's true. I think competitions and casting is a marketing tool. It's a low budget marketing method compared to traditional marketing outlets. And so even though it may give the appearance of being esports, it's actually just marketing. And so is them doing quote unquote esports, I think that's a very loose word that's thrown around haphazardly, is them doing competitions and broadcasts for the sake of marketing. Is that them pandering to esports and therefore making a bland game? I think that's a bit of a straw man.
Oh, do you think though that there's an audience expectation that multiplayer game modes are at least like aiming for that esport quality, like esport level of balance, esport viability, I guess is.
Well, I think that with tournaments, yes. I mean, and the problem with tournaments is that when you put money on the line, you're incentivizing players to play the most obnoxious, strongest means. And so then you get games like Iron Harvest. They had this like launch tournament, and the games were absolute garbage because they were like using these really gimmicky, repetitive strategies, and the game would end within the first 5 minutes generally. Whereas like what would have been a lot more fun is if you was to show a 3v3 game, because then the balance is like so much more flexible that you're seeing more of the game at hand. And I mean, when I play Company of Heroes, playing 4v4s is fun because if I play 1v1 where the balance is more tight, there's only 2 commanders that are viable per faction. If I play 4v4, I can go basically whatever commander I want. It doesn't matter because the balance is so up in the air. So I think, yeah, it's complicated. Balance both isn't fun and is fun at the same time.
Yeah, I guess something that's been really sort of interesting for me to think about is in games like League of Legends, where they've got so many heroes, you can't do like an apples to apples comparison because you'd never release anything if you have to make sure that they're balanced against like it just wouldn't happen. And so it's okay for them to be not balanced in like certain context, and like the context is very important. The context of like the context in which something is used is very important, and the fact that RTS games need to have that army in a box and need to let you have access to all the toys, and you need to have something that's viable in every circumstance. I think that's been like the most interesting sort of discovery from this conversation for me, is like you can't have an army that doesn't have all the tools in the toolbox, because then you're not competitive. You're just not going to win those matches.
Well, Company of Heroes has done this in the past, is where, for example, the US in Company of Heroes 2, they didn't have a mortar. They only had a pack howitzer, it came really late in Tier 3, and they ended up giving them one. And I think it was for the better, is because
like an infantry mortar.
Yeah, just a regular like mortar that everyone else has.
Sort of thing.
Because what would happen is you play on a certain urban map, and then the enemy puts a machine gun in a building, and then you're just helpless. Like your hands are tied, you just can't do anything. And then so it creates these really one-sided, one-dimensional matchups where, because you can't just build a mortar and clear the building out of the house, you have to slam your face into, trying to commit to their cutoff or something, or you go for this like really high risk reward play, and that just isn't fun and it's frustrating. And so on the one hand, it is sad that yes, they're homogenizing US because now they've given US a mortar. I think it's the lesser evil of now you have a more dynamic, reactive, in-depth interaction where the player can do more things, and as Brandon said, you can go into this elegant dance where you have like a good RTS game is a dance between 2 or more players where you're interacting and you're throwing out moves and your opponent's reacting to them. Whereas the opposite of a dance is this one person just stomping on the other person's foot and just controlling what they can and can't do.
Do you think there's an argument to be made for a competitive RTS where there's only one faction?
So I don't know about competitive RTS, but the game 0K, it's a fan indie project. It's a free game.
Yeah.
It's like a Total Annihilation in 3D. It's pretty fun. That has one faction.
Getting a lot of buzz at the minute.
Yeah. That has one faction, but I think it's different because it's a large scale RTS game, and because it's large scale, it's a very different type of fun. You don't really have drama in that type of
It's
game.
about economy, right?
It's about this progression. Is you scale from having a tiny little base and one commander to then at the end of the game you have hundreds of units. You have these huge battles. So I think in that game, I mean, even when I play Supreme Commander, yes, there's 4 factions. They all look really cool. They all look really different.
Yeah.
They have very superficial differences. That
It's just the hero, right? Really.
well, there is differences in the units and stuff, but unless you are very hardcore in playing Supreme Commander, at a surface level you won't notice the differences.
Yeah, it's like everyone's got a flyer, everyone's got a scout, everyone's got a...
Yeah, they all have a tank. You know, this one has more range than this one, but this one, you know, whatever. The differences are minuscule for most players. And so I think that game, you could, in Supreme Commander, if you were to have all of the factions that are cosmetically different but balance-wise are the same, it wouldn't really change the game that much, I don't think. But a game like a smaller scale game, like in Command & Conquer or Starcraft, I think you would have to design it in a very specific way to have one faction. Like I think you'd have to have heroes and sub-factions that you tech into throughout the game. Rather than, like, you'd have to have one faction with 50 units and 10 heroes, rather than just one faction with 20 units, like is what most RTS games have. Is they'll have 3 or 4 factions, each with 20 units.
And so you're saying like more factions,
more sub-factions and more sub-units within a one mega faction. So I think it could be done, but I think the problem with that is you lose the narrative. Like whereas when you play Starcraft, multiplayer even, let's say you don't even play the campaign, that there's clearly a world and a narrative and a story. You have the creepy crawly insect Zerg who want to murder everything. You have the space cowboy Terrans, and then you have the sophisticated Protoss. And then in like Dawn of War is, you know, Dawn of War doesn't even really have a narrative. You just have like, there's the planet called Kronos. 7 different races want the planet and they fight. That's the story. And by having different factions, you can sort of create this world that even if you're only playing it in like a skirmish or multiplayer context without any narrative of a story and characters, you still have this immersive world. So that you lose that when you have one faction, is you can't really have that, or you'd have to try very hard to retain that.
Yeah, I really like the example you gave about the mortar team and adding the mortar team, because it tied into what Brandon was saying about part of the skill is knowing when you're outclassed. Like, not through skill, but just like, this is a bad matchup, so I've got to get out of here. And it sounds like in the Company of Heroes 2 example, you didn't have an alternative. It's like an urban map, and so there's nothing.
Yeah, the machine gun's on your cutoff, and so you have 0 resource income because the machine gun is on your cutoff, and you can't get rid of it.
Frustrating, because they've taken away your ability to have fun.
Yeah.
It's like literally nothing I can do here. But if it was a map that was like 70% farmland and 30% urban, and that city section happened to be camped on a fuel point, at least you can do something about it. You're like, well, he's camped in there and there's nothing I can do about it. But if he's there, he's not, you know, defending this point, so I can attack this point, or I can do this, or I can do that. But it sounds like in that particular example, it's just like, there's nothing I can do.
Yeah, maps are actually really interesting because, so people praise Starcraft and Starcraft 2 for its balance, and the factions and the units are balanced in Starcraft 2 at least, but the maps are not balanced. In Starcraft, there is a right and a wrong way to have a map. You have to have a little ramp that goes into your main base. You have to have a natural base. You have to have a third base. From a bird's eye view, every single map in StarCraft is the same. they're all the same, the maps. Now, there are quirky things that StarCraft 2's tried to do with like gold bases and stuff, but really they're all the same. But you look at something, and it's because of how like specific and how rigid the units and the factions are designed. Generally, the more asymmetric the factions are, the less asymmetric the maps can be. But if you look at Command and Conquer, or you look at Company of Heroes, the maps are wildly different, especially in Company of Heroes, where because it tries not to be an arcadey sandbox game, it tries to have like real looking cities that you have like actual little villages, so you don't have purely symmetrical buildings, and it tries to sort of create a section of France rather than just a little arena. And that is something nice. Like, it is good in Company of Heroes that the maps are wildly different, and while some formulas are better or worse for competitive play, there's still multiple types and formulas of maps, rather than having a single correct way of making a map.
Yeah, I'm just looking at the top down of all of the StarCraft 2 maps now. When you look at them in this bird's eye view,
they're all the same. Yeah, because if you were to open up the main base, like the Zergling, the unit, the Zergling is balanced because of the fact that the main base has a tiny little ramp that Terran could wall off in the first 2 minutes of the game. If the main bases were open, Terran would be unplayable. Like, you would just lose every game to Zerglings rushing you, because you wouldn't have the walls and you wouldn't have the ramps. So they use maps to balance the factions.
And I think that's sort of like the underlying theme of what we've been talking about here is like, the more competitive and the more iterative it becomes, you know what works and you know what doesn't work, to the extent where there's like clear patterns about, especially in like this map design that I'm looking at. It's like, here's what works in a competitive setting, and here's absolutely what does not work in a competitive setting. And it's almost like what we've been talking about here with the sort of like homogenization is reflected in the maps, because you can see it when you're looking at the maps all top down next to each other. You can see the same pattern that's just rearranged in ever so slightly different ways.
And the differences are that seem small have a huge difference. Like, this map's more open in the middle of the map, therefore it's easier for Zerg to push out. Well, this map has a high ground position here overlooking the fourth base. That makes it good for Terran to siege their siege tanks up. Like, all these little things have these massive compounding effects.
At that level, the tiniest detail makes the world of difference, right?
Yeah.
And I guess what we're talking about is like, it's a bit it doesn't necessarily mean that it will be more fun, but it is more likely that something a bit more rough and tumble is fun. It's like the difference between Formula 1 or Destruction Derby, or like NASCAR or something. Well, I don't know if NASCAR's a good example, but it's like, the more elite, I guess, something becomes, the more like the tiny details make a huge difference.
Yeah. And I don't think it's a bad thing that StarCraft has maps that are all, from a bird's eye view, the same, because what StarCraft is aiming for in its 1v1 game, it's aiming for the fun from the mastery. It's not aiming for fun from novelty and drama. And so the fact that it has a single formula of maps, it empowers the mastery element of fun. Whereas in Company of Heroes, where there's a lot less of mastery, it still is a component of it, but Company of Heroes is certainly wanting to have the drama of Company of Heroes, the RNG of penetration and heavy mortars and all of these other effects. And so to play up that, you want to have more asymmetric map design. and even within Company of Heroes, they're asymmetric in terms of the territory, but they're all the same in terms of the resources. They all have like 1 fuel point each, basically 1 munitions point each. You have 4 or so of the strategic points each, and then you have 3 VPs in the middle of the map somewhere. So they are more formulaic with the resource system, which Company of Heroes 1 perhaps does less of because of their resource systems are more flexible with the way that you have high, low, and medium of both munitions and fuel. I personally prefer the Co 1 system of resources. I think Co 2 definitely simplifies it in a way that isn't interesting. I don't know why they'd made those changes.
Yeah, I didn't know they changed when I first started playing Company of Heroes 2. I didn't know that they changed it, so I kept running around trying to get manpower. Like, I need manpower. And then my friend was getting quite irate with me because we were playing 2v2, and he's like, what are you doing? Why do you keep going for those ones?
Yeah.
It's like, I need to build units. It's like, what are you talking about?
Yeah. All right, well, let's wrap it up. We've been rambling away for a while. But yeah, that was fun. I think we had a good summary half an hour ago, so we won't restate the summary now.
What was the summary again?
It was too long for me to rant. Well, my summary anyway is not blandness. Blandness is the devil, not balance. However, fairness is like what's more important than balance, and you could argue those are the same things, and you may have the perception of balance and fairness as being the same thing. But yeah, I love that idea of when you win it should feel because of luck. When you lose it should be because of, I said it the wrong way around. When you win it's because of luck. When you lose it's because of, no, I said it wrong again. I'm sorry. No. I'm an idiot. When you win it's because of skill. When you lose it's because of luck. And I think perhaps what more RTS games need is more drama, in a way that Company of Heroes gives. But like, Company of Heroes isn't a traditional RTS. I think there's room for Company of Heroes mechanics like RNG and area of effect that scatters and misses and like off-map strikes, but in a way that's fair with like the red smoke and stuff.
Telegraphing.
Whereas a lot of RTS games don't do that. They just have a random explosion out of nowhere, and that's really annoying. But I would love to see Command and Conquer have like that traditional style of RTS games have more dramatic Company of Heroes style mechanics in them and RNG and see how that goes in creating that drama. In a way that's a bit less twitchy. Like I play Red Alert 3, it's pretty dramatic because it has a very, very quirky, very eccentric unit design, but it's pretty hardcore in how you play it. It's a very twitchy game. What I like about Co is that it isn't very twitchy. Anyway, that's sort of a summary, but also not really at the same time. So
yeah,
thanks for listening or watching. These guys, I have put their Twitter handle on if you want to check them out. Any last words, Aiden?
No, thanks for having me. I've been frantically taking notes as we've been talking.
Aww.
It's given me a lot to think about.
Yeah. All right. Well, I can link you the thing that I've written down some stuff as well that I eventually I'll put this into like an essay once I've processed. I'm glad we had this talk now because definitely some insightful things for me to jot down. All right. See ya.
Thanks, everyone.